Welcome, folks, from myself and Marty. And say hello, Marty.
Good day. How you doing? Good day from me.
That's good. So listen, this session that we're going to go through today is an interesting one. It's about monitoring and optimizing the solutions. But the important thing is it's part of a track which is designed to help you get from DP-203 previously to move across to taking DP-700. And so where we fit in, it's because we're in our time zone as well. So this is the track for the Indian and APAC time zone, but there are also tracks for the sort of more North American time zone as well. But listen, where I fit in, so I'm Greg. I'm a long-term data platform MVP, and I'm also a member of the Microsoft Regional Director Program. If you're looking for me on socials, I have made an exit. So you won't find me on X anymore, but on Blue Sky, so at greglow.bsky.social. And you'll find many of the things I do at sqldownunder.com or at blog.greglow.com. But regardless, tell us about yourself, Marty.
Okay, thanks a lot, Greg. So I'm Martin Catherall. I am also a Microsoft MVP. Not quite as long-term as Greg, maybe about 50% of that. I cut my teeth in the SQL Server world and moved on to the Azure world about 10 years ago. I made the transition there. And I've also made the transition from the Azure world over to the Fabric world. So the sort of what this session is about, going from 203 to DP-700. I've kind of come on that journey myself, and Greg has too. So we're going to be talking about real world experiences and how we got there on our way. Over to our moderators. We've got Kelly in the background and her friend moderating as well. And yeah, do you want to say anything about them, Greg?
No, that's all great. It's good to have Kelly and Oma there helping out with this. I'm sure they'll be able to answer basically anything that pretty much comes up. And so listen, where this session fits, it's part of a series, as I said, just for people moving from DP-203 to DP-700. So much of it assumes that you've already done DP-203. There's content in here that'd be useful to you even if you hadn't done that. But most of the people who are doing this will be people who are making that migration. And keep in mind that next week, there are in-depth sessions that go much more through DP-700 for people who hadn't really had that background in the first place. And so look, on Tuesday, 2 days ago, there was an implement and manage analytics solutions. Wednesday, we had ingesting and transforming data, which is a really core part of what the whole thing is about with data engineering. Today, we've got monitoring and optimizing your solutions. And it's an interesting one because a lot of people seem to think that if you're in a software as a service world, which you are with Fabric, that you don't need to do most of these things. And that's not the case. What you do is different, but it's still really, really important to be doing this. And tomorrow, there's a session to help prepare for the exam day and have an open Q&A. But listen, one of the things coming up that we do need to mention is the Microsoft Fabric Community Conference. And so that's coming up end of March and through to early April. And that's in Las Vegas. Look, I can't be there personally, but if I could be anywhere at the end of March or early April, I have to tell you, I would be there. The one last year, from everything I saw, looked like an absolutely wonderful conference to be at. And I'd highly encourage you, if you can make it across to there, to go. And importantly, they've got a code there, so MS Cust. If you apply that, you'll get a $150 discount. And they note that the prices go up on February 11th. But even if you can't make it across to the community conference, there is also good value for the exam for DP-700. If you decide you're going to take this, there's a 50% discount on offer. And so that ends March 31st. And so it's a limited time offer. It's a while supplies last, but I think if you get in early, you should be fine with this. And there's a link at the bottom there to connect across to that. One thing I would draw your attention to in this session is that it is meant to be live and interactive. I mean, you could just watch this session online later by going off to YouTube or wherever you're going to view it from. But a lot of the value you'll get is if you interact with moderators and things in the chat as part of this session. So I'd strongly encourage you to do that. But Marty, tell us about what are we really covering in this session?
Okay, so we're going to step through kind of in a bit of detail how you can master the brand new DP-700 fabric exam. So there's a lot of crossover with the 203 exam going forward to the 700 exam. I kind of think that, over the years, things have changed in the data warehousing, data analytics space, but the general principles of what we're doing has kind of stayed very, very similar. So the technology may have changed, but the underlying principles have still stayed very, very similar. So we'll talk through all of that, and we'll also point out where things have changed and where they have remained the same. So a bit of an agenda of what we're obviously going to cover. We'll go through the skills comparison and a bit of an intro to Fabric, not massively in depth because probably most people are familiar with it, but we'll go over the basics there. And in any system, as well as optimizing it for your clients, you also want to monitor what's going on from a performance point of view, from a optimization point of view. You need to know, when things are running well, when things are not going so great, so you can tweak them in the meantime. So how do you monitor an analytics solution in Fabric? How do you optimize the same solution in Fabric? What are the things like the security and compliance monitoring tools in there that you need to be aware of? You may not use them all the time, but you just need to be aware of them. And just some practical tips about taking exams in general and specifically at the DP-700 itself. So that's what we're going to do here. And I'll just hand over to Greg to take the rest of it away.
Great. Thanks, Marty. So listen, what we're looking at this are really the fundamental skills that data engineers need to know. And we're looking at how that's different between what was in DP-203 and what's in DP-700. If you look at the comparison of the skills, the balance of this is quite different. Now, one of the things to understand is that whenever they put out an exam like this, in fact, I was a long-term author on DP-203, so it is one that I know intimately, and DP-600 as well, actually, but not the new 700. But the thing to understand is that when they put out an objective design for these things, they've got a balance there that says, here's the percentage that's allocated to each of these areas. And importantly, when they're writing questions, they are written to go into that sort of proportion. So one of the mistakes I see people make all the time is they'll have an area that they're not strong on, but they'll think that won't matter too much because maybe it only looks like a shorter thing. But the important thing to check is what the percentages say. And so if the percentage says there's going to be 30 to 35% of questions on monitoring and optimizing, then you'd better make sure that you're quite comfortable with that. And so if you look at 203, it had designing and implementing data storage. It had a lot of different options in there. So there was everything from just standard file systems and data lakes, and so Azure Data Lake storage and so on. But it also had the storage as part of Synapse in terms of the building data warehouses in there and so on. The data processing was actually across a whole lot of different products. And so importantly, that was data engineering on Azure, not data engineering, of course, on Fabric. And so that's the key difference. And so a big thing there is that when it was being done on Azure, of course, we had a whole lot of the separate products. So you could be examined on Data Factory, you could be examined on Synapse, you could be examined on Stream Analytics, and so on. So all of those sorts of things could be part of that as separate products. And then, of course, the monitoring and things that are added onto the side of that. But in the case of DP-700, that says, how do we do all of this inside the software as a service environment? And so many of the things you're going to do are very, very similar to what you were doing before, but the tooling, of course, is completely different for that. And so if we look at some of the specifics on that, in 203, we had things like data storage, as I said, mostly around data lake storage and so on. And we had partitioning, we had an exploration layer. The data processing had the ingesting, batch processing, stream processing, and so on. And so importantly, even there was a fairly sizable emphasis on things like batch processing directly in there, which is more of a straight Spark-based thing that was sort of looking at. In addition, there were other areas in there where they would look at, for example, some Kafka, Apache Kafka details and those sort of things. And so that's the sort of stuff that's sort of more downplayed nowadays, right? And so if you look at the security, it was how do we do security, but it was being done on all the individual products rather than how do we do that in an environment like Fabric. So the difference when you get to DP-700, it's more about how we configure and manage the solution more so than how do we build all the individual tools and put them together, because that's already done as part of the Fabric structure. And so if you look at the first section there is implement and manage an analytics solution. That says 30 to 35% of the questions. And so this is the configuration and governance and those sort of areas. So how do we do lifecycle management? How do we configure things in the workspace? And that's going to include things like capacity settings and all those sorts of things. How do we orchestrate processes? And so this will be, how do I make pipelines work? How do I schedule pipelines? How do I configure things in pipelines? How do I do the security surrounding areas like pipelines? In the ingesting, it's going to be, what are the loading patterns? So are we talking about incremental loads? Are we talking about refreshes? Are we talking about how we refresh semantic models and so on? That's the sort of content there. And importantly, how do we also do that for streaming data? So we often do this constantly or in batches of data, but we might also need to look at streaming data. People that I know that took the beta or beta exam for 700, and a lot of people who've taken it since, one of the comments I keep seeing people make is that they underestimated how much time they should spend on real-time analytics and so on inside the product. The real-time stuff, you really, really need to make sure that's part of what you're learning in there as well. And finally, if you look at monitoring and optimizing, even though it's a software as a service application and you're giving a lot of the management across to Microsoft to do, it's still critical that you do monitoring, that you find errors when they occur and resolve them, and that you optimize performance so that you're not paying crazy amounts of money for the services that you're using. And so if we look at the key differences between those, 203 was covering a broad range of Azure services and focusing on data storage and processing pipelines and how you do security across a lot of the tools. And so, and of course, every one of these products that it was working on is still a current product. So don't take the idea that because they're moving from DP-203 to 700, that the original products are disappearing as well. They're not. It's just that Fabric offers a different way of doing the same things in a simpler, sort of more optimized and streamlined environment. But those original things are still there as well. And so if you look at the Fabric data engineer, so this is focused on Fabric. It's how do we build and optimize analytic solutions on Fabric, but also really understanding the native tools. So while we needed to know things perhaps like Databricks or how to work with data lake storage and so on, that's still good background to know. But the important thing now is, how is that implemented in one lake? And if you start building a lake house over the top of that, how does that work? Don't underestimate the value of looking into event houses as well. That actually becomes quite a core and important aspect of this. And of course, the target audience in this case is the people who are transitioning across. But what you've got is a move across into 700. As I said, don't get the idea the other products are disappearing. They're not. But it's important to know how to do the engineering inside Fabric. And so, Marty, tell us more about Fabric.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Greg. So I just want to reiterate one thing you said there, and that's about the real-time analytics. I think, like, as we've just moved forward as a society, real-time has become kind of more and more prevalent than maybe it was when DP-700 was in its prime. And yeah, I've heard similar stories to what you've heard. People who took the exam and said, don't underestimate the fact that you might get quite a few questions on it. Go study it in quite a bit of detail. And as well as the certifications, Microsoft have got something called applied skills. So if you go to your profile on the Microsoft site, you can see your certifications. You can also see applied skills. Now, those applied skills let you take in a certification environment, and they'll give you real world problems. You could take one on say, a data lake. You can take another on real-time analytics, and I'll just walk you through a scenario and a problem, and you'll have to actually implement it online yourself. And you can take these. If you fail them, don't worry about failing them. It's all good practice. There's no real mistakes here. You can take them again. I think you might have to wait a little while, but they're really good practice to, if you're not doing a lot of one thing, for example, real-time intelligence, go do them, get a bit of hands-on experience, and that might set you up nicely for the exam. But what are we going to talk about now? So now that we really understand the similarities and the differences that Greg's talked about, we're going to dive into the content. We're going to start with a bit of, level setting, and then we're going to review what's going on. So please feel free to add your thoughts in the comments. We've got our moderators standing by to answer any of your questions or feed them through to us if we need to talk about them. So what are we going to discuss in this section? We're going to say, what Fabric is and why it's important. I'll give you a general overview of Fabric components and the architecture. Greg's mentioned OneLake, and that's a real good underlying component. I'll talk about Data Factory, which has made its way through various components, and kind of emphasize what Fabric is, why Fabric's unique and compared to other platforms. So we see a familiar diagram in front of us. And you see up the top, we've got the various experiences of Fabric. But the one thing they've got in common, you'll see, is that they all talk to OneLake. So we've got 6 experiences up the top. We've got Data Factory, the data engineering, and the data warehouse, which are pretty much 2 sides of the same coin. You can have a lake house or you can have a warehouse. A lot of similarities there, but a fair few differences. Obviously, data science, real-time intelligence that we've talked about. And then obviously the visualization angle, the Power BI, that a lot of people coming to Fabric will be very familiar with. They'll be well-versed in the data visualization side of the coin, but not maybe so well-versed in the data engineering side or the data warehousing side. And that's kind of one of the real benefits of a SaaS system, is that it's brought all these experiences together, and it allows the visualization people to work with the data engineering people, to work with the analysts. So you're all kind of getting a bit of experience of what's happening within the ecosystem. And so that's like really a high level overview of what's going on here. So I don't know if you've got anything to add to that, Greg, before we move on.
The only thing is possibly that to note the areas that are not there as part of when we look at DP-700. So if anyone took the DP-600 exam, you'd note there was a lot of time spent on Power BI, on semantic models, on DAX, on those sort of areas. And just importantly, that's not the focus of this exam. And so 600 had a much broader range of things, but this is not focused on the sort of Power BI, how do I build a semantic model, how do I write DAX queries? That's not the focus of this. So it's really important to have a look at that study guide that says, here are all the things that you need to cover off. You need to go through every one of those bullet points and go, do I know about this? You know, am I able to answer questions on this topic, and make sure that there are no topics in that study guide that you can't answer questions on. All righty. So the next section we'll have a look at is looking at how significant it is to do monitoring and optimization. As I said, a common mistake is that people assume that if you're in some sort of software as a service application, that's all somebody else's job, but it's not. And so you need to make sure things like your performance still runs well, that queries that you're running are efficient. A big part of this, of course, is the cost control. It's no different to what you see when people are provisioning other types of resources. You've got the two approaches. Some people just keep throwing money at the problem and hope it'll fix the problem if they don't have the performance and efficiency they need. Other people will spend the time to make sure that it works properly. And nowadays, with software as a service, or with even just consumption-based services in Azure as a whole, that can make a huge difference to the overall cost to the organization. So you want to allocate resources well. You want to make sure that the data that you're processing is getting through the system effectively in a timely way. And you want to know if things are going wrong and, of course, how to resolve them. And so if you look at the benefits of doing the monitoring and optimization, it lets you scale for a start. So like Fabric is designed to handle data at scale, but optimizing the data workflows and the resources lets you do that better. And so with continuous monitoring, you can identify bottlenecks, find inefficiencies, and make the sort of scaling work a lot more smoothly. Another one is, they mentioned here, risk of data corruption or loss. Mostly what that's about is that any time you're moving the data around, you need to make sure that it's happening appropriately. And so for me, that means a lot of things. So for a start, you're not changing the data inappropriately. You see where people corrupt data as they're working with it, not because the product corrupted it, but because they've done something wrong in the transformations as it goes across. Another part of that could be that perhaps the queries are not doing the incremental processing that they wanted appropriately. So, I mean, it's all well to do incremental processing, but we need to make sure that, you know, every row perhaps coming from a source needs to be processed once and once only, you know, and so on. So we're not duplicating data, we're not missing data, that sort of thing. Now, in terms of the user experience though, so whether it's the data engineers who are running pipelines or the business analysts in the end who are running reports, the performance directly affects their experience that they'll find with this. It's also important that you maximize your use of the capacity. And finally, of course, you need to set up automated alerts. So while you're still not building all of the things that do the processing, you're more configuring them, you still need to have it let you know when things aren't going the way you want. So maybe queries are running very slowly, or the CPU is really high, and so on. You need to do that to maintain the right sort of outcomes. Now, Marty, tell us about monitoring analytics solutions.
Okay, thanks a lot, Greg. So in this section, we're just going to discuss monitoring the Fabric solution overall. So as Greg said, it's a holistic environment with data flows and data pipelines and warehouses and visualizations. So there's a whole series of experiences that have come together as one solution, and we need to monitor the whole solution as a single unit and be able to look at different pieces of the whole jigsaw. So you can see here just a diagram to, call out the different parts of Fabric: the data pipelines, the data flows, the lake houses, the event streams, the Spark jobs, and the notebooks. So in Fabric, we basically schedule activities and the jobs that go with them that perform the different tasks, such as the transformations and the data movements. So there's different activities that have got different dependencies on one another. For example, a data pipeline might pull data in from the source and drop it in a lakehouse or files or the warehouse. And so they interact with each other, and we'll need to basically get to grips with how they're interacting. Is there a bottleneck or anything like that? So you need to make sure that data arrives when it's expected, in the right location, at the right time. And any system errors that occur or delays, things that can affect, your downstream activities, things that, aren't part of the activity you're doing right now, but which might be part of the activity you're going to do after this one is finished. And so you're going to have any knock-on effects of problems that have occurred in one part of the solution affecting a downstream element. So the end-to-end process needs to be managed, and we need to ensure that it's reliable, that it's resilient, and it's performant. And one aspect of that's monitoring and identifying like long-running operations, long-running errors, and things of that nature. So by doing that, you can minimize your downtime, and you can address things quickly. So the underlying causes of problems are really crucial to identify. Don't just look at maybe the symptom and have like a knee-jerk reaction that one thing's going wrong. Sometimes you know a system really well and your gut instinct is quite correct. Other times you might be far off the mark, and what you think's happening is not the root cause of the problem. So diving into things like logs and that will probably get you closer to the root cause of the problem. So you can perform the following activities in Fabric to deliver data to these users and monitor them well. So let's flick over to the next slide. And we'll see, what the monitoring process and the collection of the data is all about. What metrics do we need to ascertain if we've got a healthy system, if it's operating correctly? So the monitoring will expose any errors that have occurred and when they've occurred and what the problem was. Well, maybe not exactly what the problem was, but what occurred. You've got a log to go back and look at. So you're going to need to then investigate the issues, come up with remediations, look at the errors. And historical data is really good for that, to analyzing what went on at a particular time. And as well, looking at historical data, not just what went wrong now, what happened previously when that process run, when it run absolutely fine and there was no problem at all. So maybe what's the difference between what happened when an error occurred and what happened when no error occurred? What happened when the system was running smoothly? So continuous monitoring of the data, the ingestion, the transformations, the load processes, they're great to ensure that they're all running successfully. What else have we got to do? Let's have a look. So we've got identifying what to monitor, collecting and reviewing data, resolving issues, and monitoring performance. So we need to identify what to monitor, what to track, what metrics to collect. We need to collect and analyze the different pieces of data, and we need to do that on a regular basis. So there's no point in doing it say for half an hour here and then missing out a bit. There's no point really doing it when you have got a problem or just after the problem has occurred. You probably need to be monitoring all the time. So you've got that holistic picture of what's going on in your system. And a lot of people with all systems, they tend to collect logs and never look at them. So when things are going well, the logs are building up, that everything's going well, everything's cool. People tend not to look at the logs then, and I guess that's kind of understandable, but they allow you insight into what the system's doing. You know the system really well and how it was built and all that sort of thing. And those logs will give you a more insightful picture of what's going on. Will allow you to take action based on what you see, and that action may be different in different circumstances. And it'll also allow you to optimize and perform different tasks as things progress. So let's look at the monitoring hub. So the monitoring hub is part of Fabric. Make sure we're on the right slide. Monitoring hub collects and aggregates data. So from selected Fabric items, it processes it, it stores it, it looks at that activity, and it gives you all the data in a common interface where you can view the status of multiple different integrations, the transformations, the movement of data. It'll allow you to analyze different parts of Fabric in one single place, rather than just monitor everything separately. So you've got a big holistic picture of everything that's going on. So activities are displayed in a monitoring hub, and some of these activities you'll need to monitor for metadata, for what your metadata is telling you about what's going on. Examples might include the executions of your data flows. So we might use data flows, which are very similar to, the interface is very similar to Power Query. We might set one of those up to pull data in from our source system and take it to our Delta Parquet. We might use a pipeline for that. The downstream effect of that might be to use a data mart, a semantic model, do some sort of refreshing or some sort of Spark job. And we need to know how one of these events might affect something downstream. So we're taking a holistic look at every one of those things rather than each thing individually. Although looking at each thing individually is obviously a part of the bigger picture. So the monitoring hub can be opened by selecting monitoring from the Fabric navigation pane. And now we can view the details of the Fabric activity. Each activity in a monitoring hub that can be selected and several actions can be performed. The actions can vary quite a bit, and they include things like, retrying something. So your pipeline might have failed, maybe not in production. You can obviously replicate things in different environments. It might fail. You can retry it if you want. You can compare the details of what happened with one run to compare what happened with another run. And it will allow you to view historical details. And one example that I found really good about the monitoring hub was I run a lot of notebooks. So the notebooks basically code. So you have cells in code. And occasionally, when you're developing it, it's quite easy to monitor. You can put things in your code to output values and all that. But when things are actually running for real in testing environments and production environments, obviously you don't have that luxury. But you can actually click through the monitoring hub and you can see exactly what instance of your notebook ran, what the variables were at that particular time, and an output of the notebook as though you'd run it interactively in your development environment. And I personally find that quite good. And it's one of the things that I've learned to use quite well. So I was really unfamiliar with that about 3 or 4 months ago, and now I'm really quite familiar with it, and obviously got a lot more to explore, but I'm doing well. And I'm sure you'll find that too. You'll dig into bits of fabric, and they might be new. You are off put a little bit by new, unfamiliar interfaces, but bear with it, dive in. It'll hopefully all become self-explanatory in the end. So there's a couple more monitoring options. If you're an administrator, you might want to monitor different things than if you're a developer. And they include the Fabric admin monitoring workspace. So that's a separate workspace where you can monitor things that happen in other workspaces and things. And another thing you might want to monitor is capacities. So as hopefully you're aware, each Fabric workspace works off its own individual capacity. And that capacity is going to tell us different things about how our solution is being worked on. For example, we get more capacity units as we go up to scale, and are them capacity units being consumed in the manner that we might expect them to be consumed? Where are our peaks in the day and where are our troughs in the day? Fabric's got the capacity to kind of iron these out, so your capacity is used smoothly throughout the day. The last thing you really want is to hit an area of large consumption and you run out of capacity units. So you might use more at one point than you use at another point. And knowing that can really benefit your solution. Obviously, that benefits your users. Users are happy. Obviously, that benefits your company's top line and may hopefully result in you getting more money. So the admin monitoring workspace is a really good thing to look at. And that includes usage, Fabric usage, the adoption of data sets and reports. You'll want to see, is Greg using a fantastic report that Martin just developed? Is Martin using Greg's reports? Are other people using them? You obviously don't want to spend time developing a report or a feature that no one's using. And if no one is using it, maybe you want to know why they're not using it. Have you included something that is just irrelevant to people? And so that's not really performance, so to speak. That's more usage of the report itself. So things like that will help you develop in an agile capacity. So that's really, I don't know, I hope I've summed that up at a real high level and given you some thoughts and some thoughts to dig in more. I'm not sure if you've got anything to add on the metrics app there, Greg.
Not particularly with that. The only thing is, I just reinforce what you were saying about people having lots of reports and things that they're not actually using, and it could even be areas of their semantic models and pipelines and the areas of the lake house and so on. I often see at customer sites where people have built something because somebody had some urgent requirement for a while, but then that person has lost interest in that, and people are very suspicious about removing anything that's already there. So one of the key things, if you have monitoring of any of these usage of any of these things, it can let you know how to make rational decisions about that sort of thing. In this section, though, we need to look at performance optimization in Fabric. And importantly, if you look at the study guide, it spells out 6 areas that you particularly need to concern yourself with. And so this is optimizing lakehouse tables, optimizing pipelines, optimizing a data warehouse, optimizing event streams and event houses, which will often be quite new for a lot of people, optimizing Spark performance, or optimizing query performance, which could include T-SQL query performance in a warehouse as well. And so for many people who come from the sort of data engineering side of things and are moving across to Fabric, this is one of the areas that most people end up finding easier than others. But if you look at the key focus areas, there still is you need to worry a lot about how storage is optimized. And importantly, not just in one form. So this is in lakehouses, or if you have data warehouses, or if you have databases and so on, you need to be comfortable with all of those. And in terms of compute, obviously there's Spark related performance there, and the processing could be pipelines, could be event streams mentioned there, and so on. But all of these things in Fabric are sort of linked together. And so you're not sort of reinventing the wheel, you're sort of leveraging the tools and best practices that you already know, but in a sort of a more connected and perhaps efficient platform. And so if you look at storage as an example, with Lakehouse tables, a lot of people will come from a Databricks background or be used to building tables in data lakes and so on. So most of that Databricks style optimization, the underlying concepts of all of that are still very much the same. So if you look at the optimize command, for example, and so if we had a large number of small files, then that becomes quite inefficient. So it's important to understand how the optimize command works to be able to sort of collapse down a whole lot of small files into larger files. And so as part of compaction, there's also Z ordering or Z ordering clustering. And so this says it's not just a case of what's in each of the files, but what we're looking to do is try and make sure that the rows of data, or in the records in this case really, that are sitting in all of those files are in an appropriate order. That means that things like push down of predicates and stuff actually ends up working better. But it's still important to have a concept of partitioning and caching and to implement those properly. And so you'll have, you can reduce the amount of data that needs to be scanned for a query if you've done the partitioning appropriately. But you don't want to over partition this. So if you choose a strategy, you do that based on your query patterns. But if you over partition, of course, you can slow down and you can also make things far more complicated. Not mentioned on that slide though, but there are other things that are still just as important when working with these files. So for example, one of the things that you have with Delta Lake files is you have a concept of time travel. And so you can go back and look at what did the data look like at a particular point in time or in a particular version. Now, to make that possible, it keeps a whole lot of linked details about each of the rows and as they have changed, right? But periodically, you might decide, well, I only need to be able to go back a certain distance. And so there's a whole lot of detail in there that no longer needs to be there. And so things like the vacuum process allows you to go through and clean up that sort of situation. These concepts are all still really important for you to understand in this. Now, with the data warehouses, of course, you've still got the same sort of issues when you're dealing with a thing that's like a database. So appropriate indexing, the suggestion there to make use of column store indexes. Look, that's very, very efficient for analytic queries. So the main thing to keep in mind with column store indexes is they're never any good for like, let me just read or find one or two rows. But if I'm saying something like, let me get all of the rows for a particular year or things like that, they can be incredibly efficient at doing that sort of thing. And of course, over time, the way you partition tables can need to change. And so the keys that you're using for distribution of the data can need to change over time. But in addition to that, there are other things you might do to try and avoid having the problem in the first place. Well, one of the old quotes I used to love is they used to say that the quickest way to work something out is to already have the answer, right? And so if you look at the things that you can do here, we might decide to pre-aggregate the data. And so it's already sitting there at some level, pre-aggregated. With the data warehouses, we have an option to use things like materialized views, but it could also be just tables that are used in that sort of way as well. Importantly, compression comes into this, and the data warehouse uses compressed data. And a lot of people have this sort of mental block around compression. And I'm sure it's because of old disk compression things back in the early DOS days, where compress meant smaller but insanely slower. The thing to understand in data warehouse and so on is that compressed data is usually incredibly faster and smaller. And so it's if you're not making use of that, you need to look at that. Because what you're really saying is that in every page of the table, I'm just going to be able to store more rows in there. And that means that I do less I/O, which is super important for any sort of database. And in addition, when you have a certain amount of memory, more rows fit in the same amount of memory. This is really important. You could also, of course, you need to make a whole lot of effort to make sure that your queries are running properly. So clearly, filtering as early as you can, making sure that the appropriate indexing and things are there, or that the tables are structured to really allow for the most common queries and so on. All this stuff is still super important. Now, in terms of compute and processing, if you look at pipelines, the main thing here is to minimize the amount of data moving. And so often that will be, filter as early as you can in the chain of things, try and do things in parallel wherever you can, incremental loads instead of full loads. It's very common for us to have clients who do all sorts of levels of incremental loads. It isn't even just often one. It'll be, on a Sunday, they reload all the data. Every morning they load up to yesterday, and then during the day, maybe at different times during the day, they do, up to that moment and so on. And so, but you can only do that if you've very cleverly designed the incremental loads, because again, the problem is it's really, really easy to end up messing up your data if you don't do the incremental loads properly. When you get to real-time data, this is one where you really need to think about optimizing, particularly with filtering and aggregations, because invariably, if you look at anything that generates enormous amounts of data, it's usually things that deal with events and equipment and processes that are being monitored, those sort of things. They generate very large amounts of data. And so it's important to make sure that the filtering and the way you transform them is as simple as possible, because you want to minimize the amount that you're ingesting, but you still need to have enough to answer the questions. KQL language will be an important thing if you're preparing for this exam to really get your head around. Time windows are important for streaming data. So the typical things around how do I do windows that are tumbling or hopping, that same sort of logic still applies in amongst the event-based data. And finally, if you look at Spark, we have configurations for how big a cluster is. So nowadays, it's a bit easier where you could say, look, auto scale, but that might not be the only answer that you need to decide. And so you might need to be thinking about, how do I decide what the appropriate cluster size is for working with the Spark cluster? And again, partition sizes, caching, these sorts of things make a big difference in terms of how it ends up performing. In query optimization, as I said, they mention materialized views. As I said, we often use tables rather than materialized views. There's not a huge difference between the two. I mean, the materialized views in these data sets are typically ones that you have a periodic refresh for. And again, I could refresh that into a table. The only thing is it just adds to the amount of data. But often I find it can end up with better outcomes in terms of some of the performance and some of the options for when I'm actually loading the data in the first place. Indexing is important. Query hints, not so much. So I know they mention it there, and there are times that it really matters. But most of the time, I always feel there are not many situations where you should be using query hints. I always think that a query hint is needed if, I don't know, you go to execute a query and for some reason the SQL engine is doing it the hard way. And but it's usually because you know something that the engine doesn't know. And that's when it's valid to have query hints. Most of the rest of the time, I see people detuning things by applying query hints. And the query patterns themselves, obviously working out how queries work to minimize the amount of data that's being moved around and joined and so on. And of course, monitoring the query plans to work out which ones work appropriately and not. But the other area we need to talk about, and he said looking at Marty, is security and compliance monitoring.
Yeah, that's dead right, Greg. So security and compliance monitoring front and center of everyone's mind, whether you're doing Fabric or keeping your own passwords or doing anything you like, security is a big thing nowadays. So Microsoft in general take a layered approach of looking at security. So we see in front of us, a typical workflow going on here. So what's happening really? We've got a user opens a browser, the client application like Power BI connects to the Fabric service. We've got some sort of authentication going on, and that's going to be handled by Microsoft Entra or previously Azure Active Directory, and that's based up in the cloud. We can use typically a service principal. That would be probably the best practice to use. The web front end, that'll receive the request, facilitate the sign-in, and it'll route that request to the front end content of the user. And then we got the metadata platform. That stores the tenant metadata. So the tenant is kind of, for want of a better word, the computer, the thing that everything runs on. And that can include customer data. It can include Fabric services data, query platform data, all sorts of different things. And the authorization will take place around that point. Interesting, well, sort of a fundamental concept that I mix up myself, and I'm sure other people, authentication versus authorization. So also authentication get you onto the platform. Authorization will tell you what you can or can't do within the system. And finally, there we've got the backend capacity platform, and that's responsible for the compute operations, the storing client data. It's located in the capacity region, so you can set your capacity up in different regions. You could set capacity up in the US, Australia, Japan, wherever you like. And that leverages the Azure core services that run in that particular region. So a lot going on there, a lot of interactions are going on. So what sort of things are we going to be looking at? Fabric integration, taking data from one thing to another. And it's important now to note that we can integrate with the Entra tenant, the Azure Active Directory tenant. That's probably one of the things we'll need to look at in our monitoring. But, some of the other security big hitting items, we've got encryption at rest, kind of built into the platform. So when the data sits on your storage layer, same as it might sit on your disk of your computer, is it encrypted? If someone was to run off with your computer, could they make use of your data? Hopefully no one will run off with the disks from the data center. The data in transit, when the data flows from the data center to your browser, is it secure? Are we using TLS? Are we using role-based access control to access resources, tables within SQL databases, warehouses, whatever it is? Managed identities, obviously they were big in Azure. Workspace identities as well. So we know that one component can talk seamlessly to the other. We're not handling username and passwords all the time, although we've got mechanisms to do that should we need to. Compliance is a big one. We've got international compliance, domestic compliance, regulatory compliance of organizations. Whatever it is, whatever jurisdiction we're in, we need to stick to it. And that includes like staying in the same region and processing metadata or data in general in the region where we are. Some of the compliance certifications you might be familiar with: GDPR, HIPAA, SOX, healthcare, finance, all that sort of thing. So that's compliance. Auditing and monitoring. Like we said previously, looking back at historical data will help you tune and see what's going on in your forward-thinking phases. Private endpoints, making sure endpoints are secure. Monitoring and looking at activity logs, audit logs, activity, what's going on, auditing who actually looked at what and when, monitoring the data access components themselves, having alerts to tell you what is going on and when, and alerts that you're going to look at more to the point. Don't just leave your alerts, siphon them off to a folder and never see them again. And then when something goes wrong, it's like, oh, I didn't actually look at that. So that's a good point. And the integration you've got with monitoring tools and compliance reports from different parts of the portal themselves. So Greg, have you got any practical tips to pass this exam? You've done a few of them yourself.
Indeed. Look, the main things I'd throw in here is over the years, I've read a lot of comments from people who've taken exams, and I'm just shaking my head and going, what are you thinking, right? The first one there mentions hands-on practice. I've seen people commenting about exams where they say, they're complaining that you need real hands-on experience to be able to pass an exam. They're not joking. So what's happening here is you need to get hands-on practice. The beautiful thing is that the trial licenses with Fabric let you go through and do this, and the study guides and resources on Learn help you wander through each of these things. But there really is no excuse to end up like turning up in the exam and not having done these things. It's so important because it's not just a case of thinking through the questions. You may have a question where you need to think back and say, I did see that somewhere on a screen or things. You need, with experience, to be able to recall these things. And so look, as you said, tomorrow is the prep for exam day and an open Q&A. There's the link down the bottom for that. Mentioning again, the conference coming up, and we had the links for that.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that, Greg.
Yes.
Sorry. I actually went to this conference last year, and I'm planning to go again this year. One of the fantastic things about it is the community zone there. Attendees are able to hook up directly with product groups and other MVPs. You can have your voice heard and tell them, real world problems, and have the people who build these things actually answer the questions and give you advice. So I just thought I'd chip in and let us know that.
Awesome. Yeah. And of course, there's the exam discount, which we mentioned earlier. And finally, there are resources there, links for AKAMS. So I am ready, DP-700 prepare. But importantly, get yourself involved in the conversation that's going on, AKAMS forum DP-700, because that's where you can sit and discuss the content and get to understand it in a better way. Thanks for Marty for helping me out with this. And the other one, of course, Kelly and I, in terms of the chat area, I had a look in there just before, and they seem to have done a wonderful job of answering the questions along the way.
Yeah, I think the moderators have got a harder job than the presenters, Greg. all we have to do is talk about this stuff and we use it all the time. But the moderators are sitting there in the background answering away questions. They're doing a fantastic job. So thanks.
And don't forget, next week, if you want to go through in detail, I think the exam cram is next week, but then there's the detailed Learn Live ones coming up. It'll take you in detail through the material. So make sure you get to see those as well. So thanks again, everyone.
Yep. Thank you, and catch you in another episode.